Welcome to Visible Learning, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to talk about how we make learning accessible to all. If something is visible, that means it can easily be seen. And what we want is to have a classroom where the learning is very easy to see. There are no tricks, no secrets. Everybody knows where we're starting and where we're going. So let's talk about the three elements we will be discussing today. You will learn what a learning progression is. You will learn what learning intentions are. And you will also learn what success criteria are. So let's go ahead and get started so that you can understand all three elements of our classroom. Number one, learning progression. A learning progression is created for each unit, and it is what we would call our unit map. Each learning progression tells us everything we will learn in the unit. So it tells us from beginning to end. And when we are discussing learning progressions, you have to remember that it is just for one unit. So for instance, if this was unit 1, I would tell you everything we were going to learn in this unit. Number 1, adding decimals. So our first learning target would be adding decimals. And then we would move to the next learning target, which would be subtracting decimals. And in the unit, the last thing we would learn, our last learning target would be multiplying decimals. So for every learning progression, we have what we call learning targets. And these targets are the topics or the skills we will be learning. So remember, for every learning progression, we can call it a unit map. So if you have 6 units within one school year, you will have 6 learning progressions. It is everything we're going to learn in each unit. So for instance, this one would be our unit 1 learning progression. All right, let's move on. We are going to now discuss learning intentions. So what is a learning intention? A learning intention is our daily learning goal. It's something that we are going to discuss on a daily basis because the goal will change. So our daily learning goal tells us 2 things. It tells us what we are learning, and it also tells us why we are learning it. So our daily learning goal, or AKA our learning intention, always tells us what we are learning and why we are learning it. And I want you to take note that our learning intentions always start out with, I am learning. So for this particular standard or this particular day, our learning goal is to add, subtract, and multiply decimals. That is the what. What are we learning today? We're going to learn how to add, subtract, and multiply decimals. And our why is because we are preparing to solve word problems with decimals. So in this particular day, we would be learning how to add, subtract, and multiply decimals. And then lastly, the reason why is because we would be using them to solve word problems. So remember, a learning intention is a daily learning goal, and it always has to answer 2 questions. What we are learning and why we are learning it. Let's move on to success criteria. A success criteria tells us how we know if we learned. So these are the things that we should be able to do by the end of the lesson or the end of a couple of days of a lesson. So how we know if we actually learned. So these are our check boxes that we need to check off once we learned these skills. For instance, I want you guys to go ahead and look at our first learning target for adding decimals. Our first success criteria says I have to know what sum means. Well, sum means to add, so I can check that off because I already know that. Okay. The second thing it tells me is that I have to be able to, in order to add decimals, I have to line up the decimals, and then I have to add from right to left, and then lastly, I have to bring the decimal down. Once I learn these skills and practice them, and I know for sure that I can do them, then I can mark everything off, because that tells me I've learned how to add decimals. So for every learning target in a unit, we will always have success criteria. These success criteria tells us how we know if we learned. It's a list of skills or concepts we should be able to do or understand in order to meet the learning target. So remember, we have some new vocabulary that we need to make sure we are very familiar with. A learning progression is our learning map. It takes us from one stage to the next, all the things we are going to learn in one unit. And then we have our learning intentions. Our learning intentions tells us what we are learning for the day and why. It is our daily goal. Very, very important, so that you know every day what you should be learning. There are no secrets. And lastly, we have our success criteria. Our success criteria tells us how we know if we learned. So you can always ask yourself, did I learn today? And if you did, you should be able to look at that success criteria and mark off the items that you learned. So make sure that you become very familiar with these topics. And the reason why is you're going to be using these terms on a daily basis. You will hear these for the rest of the school year. So I'm hoping that you have a good beginning understanding of what visible learning means. Don't forget, visible learning is when you can see the learning in action. You know what the goal is. You know how you know if you learned. You always know what you're learning and why you're learning it.